Good evening, I'm Nima Rajan, and this is Forum Daily for Monday, March 21st. Tonight, we begin with a work stoppage, threatening to hurt Canada's already strained supply chain. The two sides in the dispute at CP Rail can't even agree if it's a strike or a lockout. Both the railway and the union representing 3,000 conductors, engineers, and train and yard workers were still talking with a federal mediator as of yesterday. Canadian Chamber of Commerce President Perrin Beatty says Labour Minister Seamus O'Regan must table back-to-work legislation immediately to avoid severe consequences to the supply chain. Meanwhile, COVID restrictions continue to be lifted in some provinces. Masks aren't mandatory in most public indoor places in Nova Scotia and Ontario as of this morning. But in a last-minute change, masks will still be mandatory in schools in Nova Scotia. Ontario school boards that wanted more time to keep mask mandates have been ordered to adhere to the official end date. But the Hamilton Wentworth School Board plans to keep the mask requirement until April 1st. As Russia's invasion of Ukraine continues, concerns are rising around Russian influence in cyberspace. A Canadian security software company says it has discovered a new affiliate of a ransomware gang that it calls the Swiss Army knife of cyber intrusions. eCentire says its threat response unit has been tracking an affiliate of Conti since August, and it discovered it used Cobalt Strike in 2 attacks in February. This came as tensions between Russia and Ukraine were escalating. It says the affiliate has pledged allegiance to Russia. Back in Ontario, Premier Doug Ford's government is set to introduce legislation meant to tackle illegal blockades at international border crossings. The bill would give police the ability to impose roadside suspension of driver's licenses and vehicle permits, seize license plates when a vehicle is used in an illegal blockade, and remove and store objects making up an illegal blockade. In the wake of the protests in downtown Ottawa and at the Ambassador Bridge between Windsor and Detroit, Mr. Ford says the legislation will signal to the world that Ontario is open for business. However, an ongoing protest in Calgary's Beltline neighborhood is not likely to end anytime soon. That's the message from Calgary Police Service Chief Mark Neufeld after demonstrators refused to leave a park that's become ground zero for the weekly rallies in the city. Chief Neufeld says several people were arrested at the so-called Freedom Protest in downtown Calgary on Saturday, adding that additional charges are expected. On the East Coast, a consulting firm says it could be more than a year before Newfoundland and Labrador's Muskrat Falls hydroelectricity project is producing at full commercial capacity. Liberty Consulting was hired to monitor the project's progress, and its latest report says Newfoundland and Labrador Hydro must prepare for yet another winter season without reliable power from Muskrat Falls. Liberty's report on March 11th says its authors have no confidence in recent estimates from General Electric, the company building the software, that the system could be ready by the end of May. On the other side of the country, a lawsuit that asks the court to recognize a Vancouver Island First Nations rights and title is set to start in BC Supreme Court. Members of the New Chatlet First Nation have traveled to Vancouver to mark the start of the lawsuit. The lawsuit, filed in 2017, asserts the BC and federal governments have denied the New Chatlet rights. This by permitting logging in parts of the First Nations territory on the west coast off Vancouver Island. The BC government denies the First Nation holds title to the claim area. Back in the Atlantic provinces, the 4 premiers have wrapped up their first in-person meeting since the start of the pandemic today in Halifax. The premiers expressed solidarity with the people of Ukraine and said Russia's invasion shows the need to improve Atlantic Canada's energy security. In a statement, they called for federal support to diversify the region's energy supply. Turning to the north now, where the Nunavut Legal Aid Council is set to intervene in the Supreme Court of Canada for the first time on Wednesday in a case that could affect how Inuit are sentenced. It involves the constitutionality of a section in the criminal code that limits conditional sentences or house arrest. Eva Taché Green, a lawyer with Nunavut Legal Aid, says conditional sentences are important for Inuit offenders because it means they can stay closer to their community rather than being sent south to serve time. Canada could see a new national day. Quebec is proposing setting aside one day every year to celebrate the Canadian Francophonie. It would be part of a 3-year plan to reinforce French language across the country. March 22nd would be adopted as an official day at the National Assembly. There are more than 10 million Francophones in Canada, and 2.7 million live outside of Quebec. After the break, we look at the impact of the war in Ukraine on Canada's economy. Stay with us. The 38-country OECD is warning that Russia's war in Ukraine will disrupt commerce and clog up supply chains, slashing economic growth and fueling inflation globally. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development released the grim assessment on Thursday, and it says that over the next year, the conflict would reduce the broadest measure of economic output by 1.08% worldwide and by 1.4% in the European Union. But the organization says government spending and tax cuts could limit the damage. Meanwhile, the Conference Board of Canada has also come out with its analysis of how the war in Ukraine could economically impact Canada. With us to discuss that study is Mr. Pedro Antunes, Chief Economist at the Conference Board of Canada. Sir, welcome to Forum Daily.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, this war in Ukraine is clearly a humanitarian tragedy, but it also poses significant economic risks to Canada. So tell us a little bit more about the main findings of your recent report on this.
Well, I think importantly, as you just mentioned, this is going to have an impact on the global economy. It is going to have an impact on some of our important trade partners. We don't, in Canadian and Canada, in fact, doesn't have a lot of economic or financial ties directly with Ukraine or with Russia. So we're spared those kind of direct impacts. But I think overall, the most important impact that we're going to feel from this is just this massive hit to global prices, raw material, food prices, and other prices. And that is going to stir up already hot inflation across the world and here in Canada as well. And that will be the major negative repercussion, I think, for most households. They're going to feel much stronger inflation. In fact, we think 1.2 percentage points higher than what would have been in a kind of counterfactual world without this war. So that erodes essentially our purchasing power. It takes down our consumer spending. It puts pressure on a lot of households. And at the same time, of course, higher inflation means that central banks will fight that with higher interest rates. So that is also going to put pressure on households.
On top of this, we're seeing oil and other commodities also experiencing a spike in prices. So tell us a little bit more about the impact on the Canadian resource industry as well, sir.
Well, this is where Canada has a bit of an offset. In essence, when we look at the long list of products that the Ukraine and that Russia essentially export to the world, these products are very similar to what Canada as a whole also produces. So when we think about energy, oil and oil and natural gas, so we're an exporter of those products. But down the list, nickel, copper, aluminum, potash, and of course, cereals and oil seeds. So all of these things, essentially, because of this global commodity price shock, are going to see a ramp up in price. And that means Canadian producers and exporters will benefit from those higher prices. So in all, when we look at the net impact on Canada's economy, we see it as a kind of almost a neutral this year, even a slight positive if you take a look at the benefits from these higher prices to our exporters.
And at the same time, with these higher oil prices, we're seeing federal and provincial governments increasing revenues. So how would that impact policymakers, sir?
Well, I mean, you just mentioned the OECD is calling for more spending to help offset some of this. That's what we've assumed in the kind of scenario that we've built. In essence, provinces benefit from higher royalty revenues. The federal government will benefit from the profitability of these sectors that I just mentioned. So we do see about $10 billion a year added to each of those levels of government. So provinces and territories on aggregate will see about $10 billion benefit. The federal government about a $10 billion benefit as well. And so we think some of that will be re-spent in the economy, and we've already seen some signs of that. Essentially lightening taxes on gasoline. We've seen some transfers back to households. So this is where it'll add a little bit to that to counter the negative impact on households.
All right, sir, just about 45 seconds left here, but where can our viewers go to learn more about this report?
Oh, well, thanks for asking. The Conference Board of Canada, you can find our website easily. Just Google the Conference Board of Canada.
All right, Mr. Antunes, thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Stay with us. Coming up after the break, we'll be discussing the current work stoppage at CP Rail and its potential impact on the food supply chain in Canada. We'll speak with Dr. Sylvain Charlebois, Senior Director at the Agri-Food Analytics Lab at Dalhousie University. He'll be discussing how this work stoppage will affect Canadian consumers and the prices at the grocery stores. And of course, after that, we'll have more news from around the world when we return, so stay with us. We'll be right back shortly here on Forum Daily News. Well, the pressure is on in Ottawa today as a CP Rail work stoppage enters its second day. Industry leaders and politicians are urging Labour Minister Seamus O'Regan to end the labour dispute after 3,000 conductors, engineers, and train and yard workers were off the job over the weekend. There are warnings that the rail shutdown could have severe consequences for Canada's supply chain. But a spokeswoman for Minister O'Regan said yesterday that the government believes the best deal is reached at the bargaining table. Joining us now to give us an idea of how this work stoppage will affect Canadian consumers in particular is Dr. Sylvain Charlebois, Senior Director of the Agri-Food Analytics Lab at Dalhousie University. Doctor, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Well, thank you.
Now, consumers have already been feeling the impact of inflation and rising prices even before the CP Rail work stoppage. So let's start with the current state of Canada's supply chain amid inflation, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and a third year of the pandemic, sir.
Yeah, we're just adding another factor on this inflation pile, essentially. So this is certainly a labor dispute the world didn't need right now in light of what's going on with Ukraine. As you know, the Ukraine produces a lot of grains, a lot of fertilizers. So all eyes are on North America to provide the world with more fertilizers. But unfortunately, you can't do it without rails. 75% of all the fertilizers actually, which is sold on international market, is actually moved by train. So essentially, this is a huge problem right now, especially being in March. And so a lot of farmers in the US and other places around the world are desperate to get fertilizers. And the other thing, of course, is our grains going into Canada to feed livestock. And so we are expecting the labor dispute to disrupt the livestock industry in Canada as well.
And considering that this is just day 2 of this work stoppage, what sort of impact has this work stoppage had on supply chains already?
Well, we don't know yet. I mean, it's only day 2. Typically, a labor dispute can last 5, 7, 8 days. The CN1 in 2019 lasted 8 days, but it did take about 6 weeks to recover, to go back, to get back on schedule. So every day counts, really. For consumers out there, I don't think it's going to impact consumers right away. It will take a while. Now, if the dispute lasts for more than 10 days, probably you and I would have a different conversation. But for now, it's a wait and see scenario. We'll see exactly what goes on between the two parties and, of course, with Ottawa.
All right, sir. Well, if this situation does escalate, what types of consumer products in Canada are likely going to be impacted?
Well, over the short term, I'm not thinking much about what we produce in Canada, but what we import, especially from Vancouver. And I'm thinking about products coming from Asia, in particular, center of the store sort of products. You may actually see some empty shelves as a result of that if the dispute lasts for more than 10 days per se. Now, again, I'm hopeful that it won't, but if it does, obviously consumers will start noticing. Prices are going up regardless. It doesn't matter really. But in the fall, what may happen with the dispute in some categories, it could actually extend the upswing for some categories, in particular meat products. So we were expecting meat prices to stabilize probably in the summer or early fall, but this could actually propel prices even higher.
And what about global consumers, Doctor? What about people who rely on Canadian exports?
That's my biggest concern with this labor dispute. Really, it boils down to global markets. And frankly, Canada's reputation when it comes to logistics is terrible. We've had CN in 2019, the Port of Montreal in 2020, and now this. We also had some issues with the border just recently with the convoy. If you talk to some people about Canada and its reputation, it's not reliable at all. So this is probably the biggest problem we have as a country. If we can actually consider railways, at least railways, as an essential service, we could actually reassure investors so we can actually move on and make sure that the world remains food secure.
All right, Doctor, a quick 30 seconds left here, but what are you watching for as this situation progresses?
Ottawa, absolutely. I'm not sure we're going to get a deal from both parties, but I'm looking at Ottawa, knowing how they're going to react. They actually did manage the situation quite well in 2020 with the Port of Montreal. But it was a strike, and in 2019 there was a strike as well with CN. This time is a lockout, so I'm going to be interested in knowing more about how Ottawa will handle this lockout situation with CP.
All right, Doctor, definitely have to keep our eyes on this developing situation. Thank you again for your time today on Forum Daily.
All right, take care.
Stay with us. More news from around the world coming up next. The United Nations reports more than 3.38 million people have fled Ukraine since the Russian invasion began 26 days ago. Russian and Ukrainian soldiers are fighting block by block for control of Mariupol. This is where at least 2,300 people have died, so many that victims of the war are being buried in mass graves. But despite the destruction, the city is refusing to surrender. Talks between Russia and Ukraine are continuing by video conference, with a 90-minute session between top negotiators this morning to be followed by a full day of talks in various working groups. Meanwhile, Ukraine's Nuclear Regulatory Agency says radiation monitors around the Chernobyl nuclear power plant have stopped working, and there are no longer any firefighters to protect forests tainted by decades of radioactivity as the weather warms up. It warns that the combination of risks could mean a significant deterioration of the ability to control the spread of radiation in Ukraine and beyond its borders. Late last month, Russian forces seized the plant, which was the site of the world's worst meltdown in 1986. This comes as countries scramble to replace Russian oil, gas, and coal supplies. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres says this may fuel the world's mutually assured destruction through climate change. He's warning that the strategy that major economies are taking to end fossil fuel imports from Russia because of its invasion of Ukraine could kill hopes of keeping global warming below dangerous levels. Scientists on the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change opened a 2-week meeting today to finalize their latest report about the world's efforts to curb emissions of greenhouse gases. A shortage of global oil supplies can also be attributed to attacks by Yemen's Houthi rebels in Saudi Arabia. The kingdom says that it won't bear any responsibility for a shortage to the global supply. The state-run Saudi press agency says the repeated Houthi attacks will affect production capacity and the kingdom's ability to meet its obligations. This threatens the security and stability of energy supplies to global markets. Benchmark Brent crude oil stood at over $112 per barrel on trading on Monday. All right, well, close by in Egypt, the central bank is addressing inflation. It has raised its key interest rate for the first time since 2017. It cited inflationary pressures triggered by the coronavirus pandemic and Russia's war in Ukraine, which hiked oil prices to new records. The key rate was raised by 1% to 9.75%. The war in Ukraine has shaken the global economy and threatened food supplies and livelihoods of people around the world. The repercussions quickly reached Egypt, which is the world's largest wheat importer. Moving to China now, which is dealing with its worst air disaster in nearly a decade. China Eastern Airlines has grounded its fleet of Boeing 737 and 800 series jets after a crash. A flight of 132 people aboard plunged into a forested area in southern China, causing a fire big enough to be seen on NASA satellite images. Data from the flight tracking website FlightRadar24.com shows the plane went into a deep dive from its cruising altitude of about 30,000 feet and crashed about 90 seconds later. Some big moves being made in the U.S., which has declared that the violent repression of Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar is a genocide. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken says the declaration is based on confirmed accounts of mass atrocities on civilians by Myanmar's military. The move is intended to generate international pressure and lay the groundwork for potential legal action against Myanmar, which is already facing accusations of genocide at the International Court of Justice in The Hague. Staying in the U.S., where the Senate Judiciary Committee began historic confirmation hearings today for Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson. If confirmed, the 51-year-old federal judge would be the first Black woman on the U.S. Supreme Court. Barring a significant misstep by Judge Jackson, Democrats, who control the Senate by the slimmest of margins, intend to wrap up her confirmation before Easter. Well, you didn't have to pay much to buy a comic book in 1939, but buying a 1939 comic book today will cost quite a lot. An official with Comic Connect says someone has paid about $2.4 million for a copy of the first ever Marvel comic book. The auction house says the Marvel #1 comic in question is known as a first pay copy. It's especially prized because it contains the publisher's handwritten notes about who got paid what. The COO of Comic Connect says the issue that was sold is perhaps one of the top 3 comic books in the world of collecting. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. Remember, for more news on demand, you could always visit our website or follow us on social media. Take care, Canada. We'll see you next time on Forum Daily News.